She moved through the hall quietly carrying a silver tray balanced with practiced ease, her posture straight, her steps measured, her face calm and neutral. As she had learned to keep it over years of work, the room around her was filled with soft light reflected from crystal chandeliers that hung high above polished marble floors. The air carried the scent of expensive perfume, warm food, and restrained conversation. This was a place built for power, comfort, and status, and she was there only to serve, not to belong. Her name was Alina, though very few people in that room knew it and none had reason to ask to them. She was simply one of the staff, a young woman in a clean uniform moving between tables with quiet efficiency. She had learned long ago how to become almost invisible, how to pass without drawing attention, how to exist without being noticed. It was a skill that had kept her employed and safe, but it had also slowly taught her to fold herself inward. Alina had arrived at the venue hours earlier. Along with the rest of the service staff, the event was one of the most exclusive gatherings the city hosted each year, attended by business leaders, politicians, artists, and patrons of culture. The venue itself was a restored historic estate known for hosting private concerts and elite celebrations. Everything about the place spoke of history and privilege, from the tall arched windows to the walls lined with art chosen more for reputation than feeling. She had been assigned to the inner hall where the most important guests were seated. It was considered a good assignment among the staff because tips were usually generous, but it also required precision, silence, and discipline. There was no room for error, no tolerance for clumsiness or hesitation. Alina understood this and moved with care, her eyes always scanning her surroundings, her mind focused on tasks rather than thoughts. Yet as she walked past the far end of the hall, something caught her attention and slowed her pace for just a moment. Near the raised platform stood a grand piano, its black surface polished to a mirror shine. The lid was open, the keys perfectly aligned, untouched. And waiting, it was placed there as part of the evening program where a renowned pianist was expected to perform later. But at that moment it stood alone, quiet and almost out of place amid the hum of conversation. Alina felt a tightening in her chest that surprised her. She did not stop walking, but her eyes lingered longer than they should have. She felt a familiar pull, one she had not allowed herself to feel in many years. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tray, and she forced her gaze forward, reminding herself where she was and why she was there. She had not touched a piano in a very long time, not since life had demanded other things, not since survival had become more urgent than expression. She had learned to place that part of herself far away, sealed behind responsibility and routine. Still, the sight of the instrument stirred something quiet and persistent, like a memory, refusing to stay buried. Alina grew up in a modest neighborhood far from places like this. Her childhood home was small, filled with practical furniture and second-hand items chosen for function rather than beauty. Yet there had been music in that home. Not recorded music played softly in the background, but real music made by human hands. Her father had been the one to bring it there, a man who believed that sound could shape a soul, even when money was scarce. He had found an old upright piano abandoned behind a closed community center years ago. The wood was scratched, the keys uneven, some chipped and yellowed. Most people would have seen it as junk, but he saw possibility. He borrowed a truck, convinced a friend to help, and brought it home piece by piece. Alina remembered watching him struggle up the narrow stairs, laughing despite the effort, his hands dirty, his eyes bright. From the moment the piano was placed against the living room wall, it became the center of their home. It took up space they did not have, but no one complained. Her father worked on it late into the night, tightening strings, cleaning keys, fixing what he could. He was not trained, but he was patient, and he listened carefully, adjusting sound by instinct. When he finally sat Alina down in front of it, she was small, her feet barely touching the floor, her hands unsure. He taught her gently, showing her where to place her fingers, how to listen, how to feel the difference between noise and music. There were no formal lessons, no expensive teachers, only repetition, curiosity, and encouragement. Alina learned by watching, by listening, and by trying again. When she failed, she learned to play songs she heard on the radio, melodies passed down through memory and emotion rather than notation. Those moments became her refuge. When school felt overwhelming or money was tight or arguments filled the apartment, she turned to the piano. The world narrowed to sound and motion. Her fingers learned patterns, her ears learned harmony, and her heart learned expression without words. She did not think of herself as talented. She only knew that when she played, she felt whole. That sense of wholeness did not last forever. Life shifted, as it often does, without warning. Her father became ill suddenly, and within months he was gone. The apartment felt empty even when full. The piano remained, but the sound disappeared for a long time. Alina grew older, quickly taking on responsibilities that left little room for softness. She finished school while working part-time, then full-time, helping her mother keep their home afloat. Music became something private, almost painful. She played only when alone, and eventually not at all. The piano stayed where it was, but it gathered dust. The keys stiffened, the silence grew heavier than sound. When Alina took her first job in service, she told herself it was temporary. She would save money, she would return to music someday. When that someday never arrived, she stopped thinking about it. Years passed, measured in shifts and schedules rather than dreams. Alina became good at her work. She learned how to anticipate needs, how to remain calm under pressure, how to read people without engaging too deeply. These skills earned her trust and steady employment. They also slowly erased the parts of her that once reached outward. Now standing in a hall she never imagined entering as anything other than staff, she felt the past brush against the present in a way that unsettled her. She moved on, continuing her duties, delivering plates, refilling glasses, responding to quiet requests. She did not allow herself to think about the piano again, yet her body seemed aware of it, her steps unconsciously adjusting when she passed near the platform. The evening progressed smoothly. The guests spoke in low, confident tones, discussing investments, art, philanthropy, and influence. Alina caught fragments of conversation as she moved among them. She listened without reacting, as she always did, absorbing words that were not meant for her. She was used to existing on the edge of other people's lives, observing without participating. As the main course ended, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The staff prepared for the next phase of the event, where speeches and music would take place. Chairs were adjusted, lights softened, and attention slowly turned toward the platform. Alina finished her assigned tasks and found herself momentarily without direction near the edge of the hall. The piano stood there still untouched. A staff member from another section passed by and remarked quietly that the pianist was delayed due to traffic. It was said casually without concern, as though the delay was a minor inconvenience, rather than a disruption. Alina nodded politely, though her heart beat faster at the words. She did not know why the thought crossed her mind, but suddenly she imagined the room without music, the guests restless, the program stalled. She imagined the piano remaining silent despite being so carefully placed, and prepared. The image filled her with an unexpected sadness. She pushed the feeling away, reminding herself that this was not her concern. Yet as minutes passed and murmurs grew, the absence became noticeable. The event coordinator spoke in hushed tones, with the host checking time. Looking toward the entrance, Alina stood nearby holding a tray. She no longer needed watching. Without meaning to, her hands felt light, almost empty. Someone brushed past her and apologized distractedly. Another staff member whispered that they might need to adjust the schedule. Alina remained still, her mind racing with thoughts she did not want to entertain. She felt a pull, strong and undeniable, a sense that something was unfolding whether she wished it or not. She glanced once more at the piano. Its presence felt heavier, now charged with expectation. The keys reflected the light like a row of small mirrors, waiting to be touched. Alina swallowed, her throat dry. Her training told her to stay where she was, to remain in her role, to avoid attention. Her heart told her something else, something quieter but persistent. She thought of her father, of the nights he spent tuning broken strings. She thought of the little girl she once was, sitting on a bench, feet swinging, fingers unsure but brave. She thought of how long it had been since she allowed herself to feel that brave. The host spoke again, his voice calm but strained, announcing a brief pause. The room settled into an uneasy quiet. Alina felt as though the space around her narrowed and sharpened. Every sound felt louder, every breath more deliberate. She realized she was standing closer to the piano than she should be. No one had asked her to move, no one had noticed her hesitation. She could step back, blend and disappear, as she always had, or she could remain where she was, feeling the weight of an old self pressing gently but firmly against the present. Her fingers tingled, as if remembering shapes long forgotten. Her breath slowed. She was aware of every detail, the smoothness of the floor beneath her shoes, the warmth of the lights, the distant sound of the city. Beyond the walls, she did not yet know what she would do, but she knew something inside her had already shifted. This was not a moment of decision, yet it was the moment before when possibility first appears, quietly, without promise or guarantee. Alina stood there, suspended between who she had become and who she once was, unaware that the smallest step forward would change how she was seen and how she saw herself forever. Continued in next message. The silence in the hall stretched longer than expected, and Alina felt it settle into her body like a held breath. Around her, guests shifted slightly, some checking watches, others leaning toward companions with faint impatience. The elegance of the space could not fully hide the discomfort of delay. She remained still, her tray now resting on a nearby table, unused, her hands free and uncertain. An older woman seated near the front glanced toward the piano, then toward the staff. Her expression was not unkind, only curious, as if she sensed something unresolved. Alina felt her face warm and turned her gaze away. She reminded herself again that she was not part of the program. She was there to support, not to step forward. Yet she could not ignore the way her feet had carried her closer without instruction. She now stood only a few steps from the piano, close enough to see the subtle grain of the wood and the faint reflection of the lights across its surface. The bench was perfectly aligned, waiting with quiet patience. Her thoughts moved quickly, but without panic. She considered how long it had been since she last played in front of anyone. She realized the answer was never. She had always played for herself, or for her family, never for strangers, never in a place like this. The idea should have terrified her. But instead she felt a calm curiosity, as if she were observing her own life from a distance. She remembered the feel of keys under her fingers, how each note carried weight and intention. She remembered the way music moved forward, even when the player hesitated. She understood then that music did not demand permission, it only required presence. A staff supervisor approached the coordinator nearby, speaking in a low voice. Alina caught only fragments, but understood the meaning. The delay was becoming a problem. They were discussing options: waiting longer or moving ahead without music. Neither choice felt right in that moment. Alina felt her pulse steady rather than race. She noticed this with surprise. Fear usually arrived quickly when attention threatened, but now there was only clarity. She knew that if she stepped back, she would return to her role unchanged. The evening would pass, and so would the chance. She would go home carrying the familiar ache of what might have been. She also knew that stepping forward did not promise success or approval. It promised only honesty. The outcome would be beyond her control, but the act itself would be hers. She took a slow breath and stepped closer. The movement was small but deliberate. The sound of her shoes against the floor felt louder. Then it was a few heads turned without recognition. The coordinator noticed her presence and frowned slightly, assuming she was out of place. Alina stopped beside the bench. She did not sit, yet she simply stood there, allowing the moment to exist. Her hands rested loosely at her sides. Her posture was calm and grounded. She spoke quietly, addressing the coordinator, her voice steady though soft. She said she could play if needed. The words surprised even her as they left her mouth. They were simple, without explanation or apology. The coordinator hesitated, taken off guard. He looked at her uniform, then at her face, searching for certainty. He did not find arrogance or performance, only sincerity. The pressure of the moment weighed heavily, and he nodded slowly as if choosing to trust the unexpected. A subtle ripple moved through the room as the exchange was noticed. Whispers stirred, then faded. The host looked toward the platform, confusion crossing his features, then curiosity. He gestured lightly, signaling approval, more out of necessity than belief. Alina sat down. The bench felt firm beneath her. She adjusted it slightly, as her father once taught her, aligning herself with care. Her hands hovered above the keys for a brief moment, not in hesitation, but in respect. She closed her eyes, not to escape, but to listen. The room held its breaths. She began with a single note, soft and clear. The sound traveled outward, filling the space without force. She added another, then a simple chord, letting it resonate fully before moving on. Her fingers moved with memory, guiding them rather than conscious thought. As the melody formed, the room changed. Conversations stopped, chairs stilled, attention gathered, not in expectation, but in surprise. The music was not loud or dramatic. It was honest and grounded, carrying the weight of lived experience rather than polish. Alina felt the years fall away. She was no longer aware of the audience or the setting. She was aware only of movement and sound, of how one phrase led naturally into the next. She allowed the music to breathe, giving it space to speak. The piano responded warmly. Each note felt like a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of shared history. She adjusted instinctively, shaping the melody to the room, letting it expand where the acoustics allowed and soften where they demanded restraint. Guests leaned forward, some closed their eyes, others watched her hands with focused attention. The contrast between her uniform and the elegance of the setting sharpened the impact. The waitress was no longer invisible, yet she was not performing for approval. She was simply present. Emotion moved through the hall without announcement. A sense of shared stillness settled as the music carried, feeling without words: grief, resilience, hope, and quiet strength woven together with care. Alina remained unaware of the reactions. She followed the music to its natural conclusion, letting the final chord fade gently. She did not rush to fill the silence. She allowed it to rest. When she opened her eyes, the room remained quiet for a moment longer. Then applause rose, not loud or explosive, but sincere and sustained. It wrapped around her without overwhelming. She stood slowly, her heart steady, her breath even. She nodded once, acknowledging the response, then stepped away from the piano, returning to the edge of the hall. The coordinator watched her with astonishment. The host approached, offering thanks, unable to hide his disbelief. Alina resumed her position among the staff, her role unchanged on the surface. Yet everything within her felt different. She had crossed a line invisible to others, but clear to herself. She understood then that this was only the beginning, not of fame or recognition, but of truth. She had allowed herself to be seen, and more importantly, she had allowed herself to see herself again. The evening continued, but the atmosphere remained altered. Conversations carried a new softness, a shared awareness of having witnessed something rare. Alina moved through the rest of her duties, quietly, her expression calm, her steps light. She knew that when she returned home, the piano waiting there would no longer feel like a relic. It would feel like an invitation. Part 1 continues after the applause settled, and the room slowly returned to its refined rhythm. Alina felt as though she were moving through water rather than air. Every step carried a softness she had not felt before. Her hands no longer trembled, yet they felt warm, as if the music still moved through them. She returned to her duties because that was what she knew how to do, and because routine offered safety while her inner world rearranged itself. Guests spoke to her differently now, not loudly, not with spectacle, but with a gentler attention. Some offered quiet thanks, others only met her eyes with new awareness. She accepted each response without comment, without explanation. She did not feel the need to justify herself, or to extend the moment beyond what it already was. The music had spoken, and that felt complete. The host approached her once more later in the evening, expressing gratitude with formality and respect. He asked where she had trained, and she answered honestly, saying she had learned at home as a child. The simplicity of her response seemed to unsettle him more than any elaborate story could have. He nodded slowly, as if reconsidering assumptions he had carried for years. The renowned pianist arrived eventually and performed as planned, yet the tone of the evening had already shifted. The audience listened with appreciation. But something unspoken lingered from earlier, a reminder that mastery did not always arrive with announcement. Alina observed this from the side, understanding that she had been part of something that could not be repeated or staged. When her shift ended, she changed quietly and stepped out into the night. The city air felt cool against her skin, grounding her in the present. She walked home instead of taking the bus, needing the time to feel her steps connect with the pavement. Each sound around her felt sharper, clearer, more alive. At home, the apartment greeted her with familiar stillness. Her mother was asleep, and the lights were dim. Alina stood for a long moment in the doorway, then moved toward the old piano resting against the wall. She touched its surface, gently tracing the worn edges. The keys were imperfect, some resistant, some loose, yet they felt like home. She sat and played softly, not to perform, but to remember. The notes were uneven, but sincere. She smiled quietly, feeling no pressure to be anything more than what she was in that moment. The night had not transformed her life outwardly, but it had restored something essential inside her. She understood that this was not an ending, it was an opening, one she would need to step through with patience and courage in the days ahead. The piano no longer felt silent, it felt awake. And so did she. Morning arrived gently, and Alina woke with a sense of quiet clarity, rather than exhaustion. She lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the apartment. The distant traffic, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the steady breathing of her mother. In the next room, her body felt rested yet alert, as if something inside her had aligned during the night. She rose slowly and made tea, letting the warmth settle her nerves. The events of the previous evening returned, not as flashes, but as a continuous feeling, steady and present. She did not replay the moment at the piano in detail. Instead, she felt its effect in how she stood, how she breathed, how her thoughts moved without urgency. When her mother joined her in the kitchen, she noticed the change immediately. She asked gently if Alina had slept well. Alina nodded and smiled. The smile surprised her, because it came easily, without effort. They spoke briefly about the day ahead, about errands and meals and ordinary things. Neither mentioned music, yet the presence of it sat between them like a shared understanding. Alina left for work earlier than usual, choosing to walk rather than take the bus. The city felt different to her, not brighter or louder, but more open. She noticed small details she usually passed without thought: the rhythm of footsteps, the pattern of light through shop windows, the soft echo of sound beneath her own movement. At the venue, the staff gathered as usual, preparing for another event. Though the setting was familiar, Alina sensed a subtle shift in how she was regarded. A few coworkers looked at her with curiosity, others with quiet respect. No one asked questions outright, yet the energy around her had changed. She acknowledged this without reacting, allowing the moment to pass naturally. As she began her duties, she noticed her own movements were more assured. Her hands were steady, her posture relaxed. She was not performing confidence. She was simply present in herself. This difference did not draw attention, yet it shaped every interaction. During a quiet moment, the coordinator approached her. He spoke carefully, choosing words with intention. He thanked her again for stepping in the night before, and said the host had expressed deep appreciation. He did not promise opportunity or make suggestions. He simply acknowledged her contribution as something rare and meaningful. Alina listened and thanked him in return, feeling no need to expand the conversation. The rest of the shift unfolded smoothly. Alina worked as she always had, yet she felt no urge to disappear into the background. She understood now that being visible did not require effort, it required honesty. She allowed herself to exist fully within her role without shrinking or reaching. As the day moved on, she thought about the piano at home and the piano in the hall, not as symbols of possibility, but as parts of her life that had always belonged to her. She realized she had never truly lost music. She had only set it aside while carrying other responsibilities. Now it had returned, not demanding change, but offering balance. When her shift ended, she walked home again, choosing the longer route. She felt grounded in her body, aware of each step. She did not imagine future outcomes or dwell on what others might think. She stayed with the present, allowing it to unfold without resistance. At home, she sat at the piano once more and played slowly, deliberately. She focused on touch and sound, letting each note settle fully before moving on. The music felt less like memory and more like conversation, something she could return to whenever she needed clarity. She stopped before fatigue arrived, closing the lid gently. She understood that this pace mattered. She did not need to rush toward anything. She had opened a door, and now she could walk through it step by step. As evening settled, she felt gratitude without attachment, pride without tension, hope without expectation. Part 1 of her journey was still unfolding, shaped not by spectacle, but by truth, and she sensed that whatever came next would grow from this grounded beginning. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. Rewrite the content without them. The following days unfolded with a quiet steadiness that surprised Alina. She expected restlessness or doubt to surface after such a moment, but instead she felt anchored, as if something inside her had found its place. She continued her routine without resistance, waking early, preparing meals, working long hours, and caring for her mother. Yet beneath those familiar actions, there was a subtle shift in how she experienced herself within them. Music began to slip naturally back into her days, not as a grand return, but as a gentle presence. She played in the evenings after work, sometimes only for a few minutes, sometimes longer when time allowed. She did not chase perfection or attempt to recover lost years. She focused instead on listening, letting her hands rediscover patterns, and letting sound guide emotion rather than memory. Her mother listened from the other room, often without comment. One evening, she stepped closer and stood quietly beside the piano while Alina played. When the final note faded, she placed a hand on Alina's shoulder and said it was good to hear the house breathe again. The words were simple, yet they carried years of unspoken understanding. Alina felt tears rise, but did not turn away. She let the emotion pass, naturally held by sound and presence. At work, the atmosphere remained respectful and calm. No announcements were made, and no attention was drawn to what had happened. Yet Alina noticed how certain guests looked at her differently. Some smiled more warmly, others spoke with a softness that suggested recognition rather than curiosity. She accepted each interaction without attaching meaning or expectation. One afternoon, during a lull in activity, she found herself near the hall where the piano had stood. The space was empty, now cleared for another event. Yet the memory of sound lingered for her, as if it had settled into the walls. She stood there briefly, then returned to her duties, grounded and composed. Alina began to understand that what she had experienced was not an invitation to become someone else. It was an invitation to return to herself. She had not gained something new, she had reclaimed something essential that had always been waiting quietly. She no longer thought of herself only in terms of function or utility. She recognized the depth she carried, and allowed that awareness to shape how she moved through the world. She spoke when needed, she rested when tired, she listened when uncertain. This balance felt unfamiliar yet deeply right. At night, she sometimes dreamed of her father, not in moments of illness or loss, but in those early evenings, when music filled the room. He appeared calm, smiling, watching her hands move across the keys. Without instruction, she woke from those dreams, feeling comfort rather than sorrow. Alina did not know where this path would lead, and she did not ask herself to define it. She trusted the pace that had carried her this far. She allowed the days to shape her rather than trying to shape them. The piano remained a place of truth for her, not a stage or an escape. She approached it with respect and gratitude, understanding that its role in her life was not to impress, but to remind. As this part of her story continued to form, she felt something rare and grounding, a sense of alignment between who she was and how she lived. It was not dramatic or loud, it was steady and sincere. And in that steadiness, she found the strength to continue forward without fear. As time moved forward, Alina noticed that her awareness extended beyond music into other parts of her life. She paid closer attention to how she spent her energy, and where she allowed pressure to enter, she began to recognize habits formed from years of necessity and learned which ones still served her, and which no longer did. This awareness did not bring conflict, it brought choice. At work, she continued to serve with care and professionalism, yet she no longer felt defined by the role. She understood that service was something she did, not something she was. This distinction gave her freedom. She carried herself with quiet confidence and spoke clearly when needed, without apology or defensiveness. One evening after a long shift, the coordinator asked if she would consider being available again if unexpected changes occurred during future events. The request was offered carefully, without expectation. Alina listened and said she would consider it. She appreciated the respect in the approach and the space to decide without urgency. At home, she and her mother began sharing more stories from the past. Some were joyful, others difficult, yet all felt lighter now, spoken without fear. Music often played softly in the background as Alina practiced or improvised, filling the apartment with warmth. The space felt less like a shelter and more like a living place shaped by presence and care. Alina also began writing small notes to herself after playing, not about technique, but about feeling. She described what certain melodies stirred and how her body responded. This practice helped her stay connected to her inner voice and grounded her growth in honesty rather than comparison. She noticed that when challenges arose, she responded differently. Instead of withdrawing, she paused and listened. Instead of rushing, she chose patience. This shift affected even simple moments like waiting in line or navigating crowded streets. She felt less tension and more trust in her ability to move through uncertainty. On her days off, she walked through parts of the city she had avoided for years, visiting small parks, libraries, and quiet cafes. She observed people with curiosity rather than distance. She realized how many lives carried unseen stories, and how easily talent and kindness could be overlooked. This realization deepened her compassion without making her feel small. The piano remained central, but not consuming. It was a place she returned to rather than escaped into. She respected its power, and treated it as a companion rather than a test. This relationship allowed her to grow steadily without fear of loss. As part 1 continued, Alina felt grounded in a truth that did not need validation. She had listened to herself, and responded with courage. That choice had reshaped her days quietly, and completely preparing her for the unfolding chapters ahead without demanding answers before their time. As the weeks passed, Alina settled into a rhythm that felt natural and steady. She no longer measured her days by what might happen or what had already happened. She focused instead on what was present and real. The memory of the evening at the piano did not fade, yet it no longer felt heavy or distant. It felt integrated, like a note that had found its place within a larger piece of music. At work, she noticed that her coworkers relaxed around her. They no longer watched her with curiosity, but treated her as they always had, with an added layer of respect that did not require explanation. Alina did not seek conversation about the event, and no one pressed her for details. This quiet mutual understanding allowed her to remain grounded without feeling exposed. She continued to play at home with intention. Some days, she practiced familiar melodies. Other days, she allowed her hands to wander freely, discovering new sounds without judgment. She learned to stop when her body felt tired, and to return when she felt open. This balance protected the joy she found in music and kept it honest. Her mother often sat nearby reading or preparing food, while Alina played. They did not speak much during these moments, yet a sense of connection filled the space. Alina realized that music had become a shared language between them, one that carried memory, healing, and presence without the need for explanation. Occasionally, Alina caught herself imagining the future, not in grand terms, but in quiet questions. Would music become more visible in her life? Would she share it again outside her home? Would she be asked to step forward once more? When these thoughts arose, she acknowledged them gently and let them pass, trusting that clarity would come through action rather than speculation. She also noticed a change in how she treated herself. She rested without guilt. She allowed moments of stillness without labeling them unproductive. She recognized her own resilience and honored the path that had brought her here. This self-respect strengthened her more than any praise could. One evening, she returned home after work and did not go directly to the piano. Instead, she sat by the window watching the city lights flicker on as dusk settled. She felt content in a way she had not known before, not because everything was resolved, but because she was no longer avoiding herself. Alina understood that this phase of her life was about integration rather than transformation. She was learning how to hold responsibility and creativity together, without letting one erase the other. This understanding gave her confidence rooted in experience rather than hope. As part 1 moved toward its close, she felt ready for whatever might follow, not because she expected opportunity, but because she trusted her ability to respond with honesty. The piano had awakened something enduring within her, and that quiet awakening would guide her forward step by step. As the end of this chapter approached, Alina felt a calm awareness settle into her daily life. She was no longer waiting for something to happen, nor was she trying to return to the past. She lived in the present with a sense of quiet readiness that shaped her thoughts and actions without force. The piano no longer felt like an object tied to memory alone. It felt like a living presence, one that responded when approached with honesty and patience. Alina understood that music had become a mirror reflecting her inner state. Rather than a skill to be measured, she played when she felt open and rested, when she did not, trusting that both were part of the same rhythm. At work, she continued her responsibilities with care and professionalism, yet she noticed that she no longer disappeared within them. She was fully there, attentive and composed, allowing her presence to be felt without effort. This shift did not disrupt the environment. It enriched it in subtle ways that others sensed, even if they could not name. Her relationship with her mother deepened through shared quiet moments. They spoke more freely about the past, acknowledging both pain and gratitude. Alina realized that returning to music had allowed healing to move gently through their home, touching memories that had been locked away by necessity. She reflected on the evening at the event not as a defining achievement, but as an act of courage rooted in truth. The importance of that moment lay not in who witnessed it, but in how it changed her relationship with herself. She had listened to an inner call and responded without demand for outcome. Alina felt gratitude for the people who had unknowingly supported that choice, the coordinator who trusted her, the guests who listened without judgment, the absence of resistance. When she stepped forward, these elements had aligned briefly to allow something real to emerge. She understood now that talent did not need to be announced or proven. It needed space, attention, and willingness. The piano had offered her that space, and she had accepted it. As part 1 reached its natural close, Alina stood firmly within herself, aware that future chapters would bring new challenges and decisions. Yet she felt prepared, not through certainty, but through trust in her ability to listen, to respond, and to remain honest regardless of where the path led. The quiet awakening within her, was complete and steady, forming the foundation upon which the rest of her story would unfold with patience, courage, and truth.